So how did our ancient Greek text get from this to this? On this side we have Sinaiticus, which is a 4th century text, and as you can see it has no spaces, it's all capitals, there's no punctuation, there are no accents, there are no breathing marks, there are very few markings of any sort except perhaps that overhang that we see in the top left-hand corner. And if we look at this text on the right, this is from the Tyndale House Greek New Testament. Both of these are from the Gospel of John. This one's from John chapter 1 verses 1 to 3. This one's from John chapter 1 verses 1 to 5, as you can see. But you can see there's a huge difference between these two texts. And in this video, I'm going to explain some of the developments that took place approximately when they start to become popular or start to become more evident in texts, and effectively what they mean. So let's get into it. If you've never learned Greek before, this is really just a basic primer, if you like, and just some of the markings that you'll find in your Greek New Testament. If you're using an interlinear, for instance, these will be helpful for some things, perhaps, particularly for pronunciation. And if you are interested in some pronunciation help, then I would encourage you to go to bma.to/pronunciation and download our free pronunciation guide for modern pronunciation. And if you're moving from Erasmian pronunciation to modern pronunciation, this provides a side-by-side comparison. So let's talk about how we got from this 4th century text to this modern day text and some of the markings that we find along the way. First up, let's talk about spaces. You can see here that there are no spaces in Sinaiticus, and most of the time this was because ancient texts were on vellum or parchment, which was considered to be more expensive and a little scarce, and so the tendency was to try and use these texts as effectively, as efficiently, if you like, as possible. And so as a result of this, what they did is they left out spaces. And this isn't too bad an example, but some of these examples actually have text just rolling from one line to the next line without a break or a hyphen like we might see in English today. And so we need to be aware that that's just the way things are. Now, this isn't a problem if you know how to pronounce words and you're familiar with syllabification, how to make words into syllables and how the language works and all that kind of thing. For us modern readers today, this is a little bit more challenging and takes a little bit more getting used to. So we have these nice Greek texts that have been given to us and delivered to us over the centuries. These modifications have taken place. And the first one really was spaces. Spaces start to become a thing from about the 9th century AD onwards. And so prior to that, and particularly in uncials, which is uppercase, which just generally didn't use many spaces, if at all, and mostly it was once we started getting into minuscules, these texts that had lowercase letters, that's where you start to see more spaces starting to pop up. Another innovation we see is accents, and accents we see them in places like Vaticanus in the 5th century, but they don't really become popular until the 6th century, where they start to become a little bit more widespread. There are 3 accents in Greek, and for the most part, if you're reading and using modern Greek pronunciation, we just pretty much pronounce them all much the same. It's just where you place a little bit of stress when you look at a word. So theos, for instance, not theos, theos. It just tells you where the emphasis is supposed to be placed. Another example here, prophetes, and you can see here the eta takes a little bit of stress in this particular case. So those are examples of the acute accent. We also find examples of the circumflex, which is really just like a squiggle, and this appears over long vowels, and later on as you get into more Greek you find that this is actually a good marker where typically contractions between vowels have taken place, and it's a good indicator that that's there. That's not what it's for, but it just happens that it's a good marker for that as well. And then finally there's the grave, which tends to be the accent that gets switched around when a word is following, which is going to have its own accent on it. You tend to find that the word prior to it switches from an acute to a grave accent. So these are the 3 accents that we tend to find in our modern Greek texts. Now in our modern Greek texts we also have breathing marks. For modern pronunciation you can largely ignore them. There is a smooth breathing mark and a rough breathing mark. These go over the first letter of a word if that word starts with a vowel. If the word starts with a diphthong, which is 2 letters that create one sound, so to speak, it will go over the second letter of the diphthong. There are also some what's called diacritical marks that we find in our Greek New Testaments today, and there are 3 of these that we tend to find occasionally scattered throughout our text. One of these is what's called a diaeresis. Diaresis is used when we find that two letters that could normally be a diphthong or a monophthong, that is two letters, two vowels together. When we find two vowels together and the author doesn't intend for us to pronounce them as a diphthong as they normally would be, then they will put a diaresis over the second letter of that diphthong to indicate that we should pronounce these two separately. So a good example of this is the name Isaiah. Isaiah, when you look at it, you would naturally, if it wasn't for the diaresis, you'd naturally pronounce it Isias. E-C-is, because that's how you would pronounce that middle diphthong. However, because the diphthong is there, it's actually got 4 syllables, and so we would pronounce it Isaias. Okay, so Isaias is how you would pronounce a diaresis in modern Greek. Then we have an elision. An elision is like an English apostrophe. This tells us that a letter is dropped out, and this typically happens when one word that finishes with a vowel is followed by another word that begins with a vowel. And when that happens, the last letter, that last vowel of the first word, often drops out and is replaced with an elision mark, with an apostrophe, if you like. And this just helps it to sound better, because you don't want to necessarily pronounce the same sound twice. So diavto, for instance, you don't want to pronounce it diavto all the time. You want to be able to just speak it a little bit more naturally, and to do that you'd go diavto and you'd put an elision mark in there to indicate that the alpha from dia has dropped out. Same with ipavto, again, to do the same thing. And then finally we have a crasis marker. Now a crasis is two words that have been merged together to form one word. And when this happens, we typically find that one or more letters drop out. A classic example of this is cargo. Cargo is a crasis of ki plus ego. And when we put those words together, the iota in ki and the epsilon in ego drop away, and we leave this little marker at the top of them to indicate that there's a change that's taken place here. Now, it looks a little bit like an accent, but you end up with two accents, if you like, on one word. And the reason for that is because it's just indicating to you that these two words have been mashed together, if you like, and a change has taken place here. It's not that a letter has dropped off the end and there's still a space there, it's that there's a whole bunch of changes that have taken place in this one indicator, in this one place, and that's indicated with that little crasis marker. So that is a crasis. Now, one last question that's worth asking is, if we go back to those ancient days and we look at those ancient texts and we see all these words just crammed together, we have to ask the question, how did they know where new sentences began if they didn't have full stops and periods and commas and all these kinds of things? Well, they actually used what's called PostPositive Conjunction to indicate the development of new thoughts. We see the same in Hebrew as well as in Greek as well. The most common ones are di, kar, un, and te, and we see these being used not as the first letter or the first word in a sentence, but as a second, third, fourth, or sometimes a little bit afterwards in the sentence structure to signal that the reader has just begun a new thought. Now, in English, when we translate these, we need to put them first, and hence the name we call them in English postpositive, because they are further down the track than they ought to be, and we need to move them up in our translation. However, we can just understand these as developmental markers, and they work perfectly fine. Sometimes we don't even need to translate them because, honestly, we have punctuation now, and we don't like to start translations with words like and, which is what we have with day, and therefore we can obviously sometimes just leave those off. Other times it might be but, and sometimes it's good to leave that in. So as you start Greek, if you're learning for the first time, these are really good things just to sort of continue to add to your translation for a beginning part, and then later on feel free just to drop them when it's appropriate. Can't do that typically for un or gar, because those two words are inferential or logical in a sense that they give you either an explanation of what's come prior or an inference from what's come prior. But te and de, sometimes you can leave those out of your translation. Question marks. Greek doesn't use question marks like we did. In fact, there are no question marks prior to about the 10th century BC in these manuscripts. Now, how did you know there was a question? Well, you'd start the sentence with an interrogative pronoun. The interrogative pronoun would be tis or pos or something along those lines, which corresponds to English words like what or who. So if we say, who stole the car, then we would know that we're asking a question, and we don't need a question mark to be blinked up in front of us to know that that's the case. And it's the same in the writing of Greek as well. However, one thing about question marks in text is they tell you where a question finishes, and so in English we use a question mark. In Greek, on the other hand, they would use what we would regard as a semicolon. In other words, a dot over a little comma, if you like. That in Greek is a question mark and indicates this is the end of a question. Now, sometimes you don't have that interrogative pronoun at the beginning, but you still have a question mark at the end. So check, sometimes it's worth just noting that as you go through a sentence and you see a question mark, you might need to rephrase some of those occasionally just to make sure you capture that this actually is a question. Finally, stops. There are a number of stops. In fact, you can think of stops as gradients, if you like, on a scale. There is a full stop, which is a period. There is a semi-stop, if you like, which would be a semicolon, and then there would be a soft stop, which would be what we would call a comma. Now, a soft stop, a comma, is really saying these two things are both related closely together, and so you want to treat them as two parts of one same sentence. An example of this is in John 9:5, while I am in the world, comma, I am the light of the world. Note there's no development marker, day or te in here. These are both just two parts of the same sentence, and so they should be kept together, and a comma is a great way to do that. A semicolon creates a slightly sharper division between two parts of a sentence. A good example of this is Ephesians chapter 2, verse 11 to 13, where we see, therefore remember that you were at that time without Christ. Okay, and there's a whole bunch of things that Paul adds in here, which we're skipping here. I'm just trying to consolidate the sentence down. Remember that you were at that time without Christ, having no hope and without God in the world, semicolon. But now in Christ Jesus. And so he's given you all of this stuff, and then he's given you the other half of the sentence. There's a development marker here, but it's not a strong development marker to say this is a whole new sentence. It's still related to what's come prior, and so the editors have said we should probably try and keep these ideas together. So treat this as a semicolon, treat this as one whole sentence, therefore one whole thought on its own with perhaps a number of different pieces that are part of it. That means then we have four main punctuation markers. They weren't there to start with, that they have been developed over millennia in the text by different people who have been copying texts and making them easier for others to read, and therefore we today are the beneficiaries of all of that work that has gone on before. So I hope this has been helpful to give you a bit of an overview of some of the markings and whatnot that you find in your Greek New Testament today. And if you are interested in going further and learning more about how to read these texts more fully, go ahead, check out bma.to/get started, and that will give you a bit of a jump start into what's required to learn Greek. You can also download our pronunciation guide at bma.to/pronunciation to help you learn how to pronounce things in modern Greek, and hopefully you'll do a much better job of that than I do, as I'm still transitioning my pronunciation over. If you got this far in the video, thank you so much for watching. Leave me an apple emoji in the comment section below to let me know you got to this stage. And if you haven't already done so and this has been helpful, hit the like button. That really helps us out. And don't forget to subscribe if you want more content like this. I look forward to seeing you in the next video. Until then, keep taking small, consistent steps toward mastery. We'll see you then.